The inspiration behind A Delicate Situation basically happened in about 3 stages. In 2008, I was awarded a AsiaLink residency where I chose to go to Malaysia, and I chose to do take a residency, choreographic residency at Rimba Dahan, which is an arts residency out maybe about 40 kilometres outside of Kuala Lumpur. And here I decided to investigate something different, something that wasn't necessarily what I had been used to making choreographically. I had just been in Scotland working with a company over there, and particularly with a physical theatre director that's very brilliant at making dark theatre and dark work. And having been interested in narrative within dance, I learned quite a lot from him. I was really quite inspired, and so I decided to try to attempt to create something that was much more darkly motivated. So I particularly chose to work with a Malaysian myth and a dark Malaysian myth. So I chose what they call in Malaysia a Pontianak, and this myth is said to be a myth about women that have died at childbirth, and they believe that when they have died at childbirth that they turn into female vampire ghosts. So I spent my time at Rimba Dahan creating a work that depicted the story of this Pontianak. And it was successful. It was presented as a full-length work at the Kuala Lumpur Performing Arts Centre, KLPAC, and it was received really quite well in Malaysia. Because they believe in it, there were a lot of people, it was slightly controversial in that a lot of people had fear of seeing a Pontianak on stage, so didn't want to come and see the work. One of the performers wanted to bless the theatre. So this myth is really quite a strong myth in Malaysia. The work was awarded a couple of awards: Best Female Performer, Best Costume Design. The second stage of the development, basically, I went through an experience of dealing with losing somebody, dealing with death, and it had quite an impact on me as a person, and I became quite fascinated by death in itself and the fear of death and being confronted by death. The story of the Pontianak is very much associated with death. So I think it was probably part of my grieving process where I decided to do an unfunded development of this work in Australia, and particularly looking at death and dying and what that can do to a person and the difficulties in dealing with that, whatever that might be. And this is when I decided to invite Carol Wellman-Kelly to join me on exploring this venture. So we basically took a month and explored the ideas of death and dying, and I took the image of the Pontianak, I took it directly, the image that we had created, myself and the costume designer at the time, which was Eb Lambert from Canada. We decided to take the image of this and form it into death and look at this image as death in itself and see what we can do with that. So we spent 1 month. Eb Lambert flew from Canada to come over and join me, and we spent this 1 month exploring the whole idea of death. Following that, it was really quite successful. I really got quite attached to the work in that format, and following that I took some time away from it. And in that time went back to Scotland, went back to work with this particular physical theatre director, so of course was inspired much more in investigating this work as a dark work. I decided in that time that I did not want to lose the essence of the work, which had the vampire themes behind it. It had that dark image of death and the horror, urban horror that was attached to that. I decided that I wanted to find a way of blending the two together and find a way of really being able to depict the story of death and the confrontation with death and how we can do that through this myth of the Pontianak. So I spent some time really trying to look at how this could happen. One of the ways I believed it could happen was to take Carol Wellman-Kelly and myself and go to Malaysia, back to Rimba Dahan, invite the original sound designer, to invite one of the original performers, and spend some time in the studio and really investigate how we can blend this work together and how we can pull the ideas of the Pontianak into our ideas of death and the process of death, and see where some of those links are and where we can take it further. this was a great experience, and particularly because to bring Carol into Malaysia and to really understand how this myth and how superstition and how ritual is a huge part of the history of this culture and the weight of it, and particularly being on Rimban Dahang, which is saturated with natural forestry. It sits on 40 acres of natural forestry, and because Malaysia believed that a lot of these myths exist in the forest, you could really get a sense of the depth of some of these myths and stories. So that was really particularly fantastic, to be able to understand the nature of Malaysia's culture as well as the nature of these myths. So that we were really lucky to have Arts SA fund us to do that. Following this is when InSpaces, which is where we're at now, InSpaces invited us to undertake a 4-week development through the InSpace Development Program. So we've been able to now bring everybody together, which is Eve Lambert from Canada, which is also Harish Singh, the sound designer from Malaysia, Suhali Michelin, the original performer from Malaysia, and Carol Wellman-Kelly. The title of the work came from, and during the development of the initial creation in Malaysia, during the AsiaLink creation, it was very much because of associated with the myth. We had a woman in the work, one of the performers was 5 months pregnant, and because the myth itself is associated with women that are pregnant die at childbirth, if they die at childbirth, they become this awful Pontiana. It became a very delicate situation for her to be in, to actually be performing in this work. Many of her friends warned her that if she was to perform in this work, then she's jinxing the baby, there's something awful could happen to the baby. So it came from the whole experience of the Pontiana and how delicate that would be. It's quite expensive to be bringing everybody together at the same time, so to really make the most of these 4 weeks is quite difficult, because we feel like we're on speed going through it, trying to make sure that we get most of the bulk of the work done with everybody together. I think also there's a lot of cultural differences in everybody's work ethics and the way people deal with work process as well, which is great. I think it's really quite fantastic. That's the whole point about cultural diversity and the objective of being involved in projects like this, is to be able to bring everybody's different work experiences and work processes to a studio to get to introduce everybody to the different ways of working. I have to admit that it forces me to work a lot harder in the process as well. It forces me to obviously find new ways of working to deal with the differences. It forces me to think in different ways about how to find what it is I want. It also forces me to articulate what I want in very specific ways and be very clear about what my objectives are and how I go about getting them, because sometimes everybody's interpretations of things are very different because we come from very different angles. So it really forces me to find new pathways and open up new doors to find the angle that I'm looking for and the direction that I want to take the work. And this is definitely not a negative thing. This is definitely a positive thing, or there is no negative and positive outcome. It's just the way that it is, so which is great. It's exciting. And I think also because I have spent a fair bit of time working overseas in different cultural environments and in different countries, I think I do understand about how you need to adapt in order to be able to get the best out of something.